Final Fantasy VI, a role-playing game from 1994, and the golden era of JRPGs, the 90s. Squaresoft's third opus of their flagship series on the SNES. A game that has inspired countless bodybuilders to punch trains, and many army generals to practice singing opera. A game almost universally loved and praised, and rarely, if ever, criticized. A game that deserves most of the praise, but also one that yearns for some new opinions from someone who takes a slightly more critical or even cynical look at it. A game that requires a full game review.
Oh, my hero, so far away now, will I ever see your smile? I'll go punch a moving train.
I've always loved Final Fantasy VI. It's a damn good game, especially for its time. I've also always been somewhat frustrated with Final Fantasy VI. We are talking about one of the most acclaimed games, if not the most acclaimed game these days, in the franchise. And yet, it has flaws. Loads of flaws. From the very beginning, there are many things about the setting and story that make little sense. Because of this, I've decided to go through the entire game, skipping most of the battles of course, and review it from the first scene to the last. Join me, won't you? While we're on the subject of the game's first scene, however, this is an excellent example of how to start a game. The intro exposition credits are short and sweet, giving us just the right amount of backstory, and then we get this scene, where our as of yet nameless protagonist and Biggs and Wedge travel to Narshe through the snowstorm. The visuals and music combine beautifully here, and I don't know about you, but I am hooked from the first moment every time I play the game. By the way, I was 5 years old during the game's release, and I didn't even get to play it before 2006, so the graphics were obviously incredibly outdated first time I laid eyes on them. Still, a lovely combination of gorgeous music and inspired pixel art will always be something that's timeless in my opinion. This opening is simply sublime. That said, I still have a problem with how the story in Final Fantasy VI gets going. It seems to me more than a little contrived that Terra is sent with Biggs and Wedge to retrieve the Esper from Narshe. Terra is one of the Empire's most precious resources. She is basically a living weapon. Gestal personally kidnapped her when she was a child, after murdering her mother. I just don't see him ever taking such a risk as to send Terra on a mission with only 2 more allies, into a town that, according to the game's own words, has the strength to stand up to the Empire. That's just asking for trouble. And you guys are going to hate me for this, but I'm going to show just how little sense this makes by bringing up the map of the World of Balance. Just look at how risky this endeavor was for the Empire. They sent Terra halfway, not even halfway, all the way around the world, and her path must have taken her pretty close to both the Returners' home base and Figaro. Now that's what I call a needless risk. I know what the response to this criticism probably is. If Terra doesn't end up alone in Narshe, there's no story. But it's still contrived. In my opinion, a better beginning would have been the Empire simply conquering Narshe in the opening scene, and Terra could have ended up being rescued after her unit accidentally discovered the Esper. I mean, the 2 Magitech Armor Knights and Terra are so overpowered with just the 3 of them that Narshe wouldn't logically have stood a chance against the Empire's forces. Such an opening would also have given us a stronger sense of just how powerful the Empire had become. And the Returners, snatching Terra right from under the Empire's nose, would have been exciting as hell. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't completely dislike how the story gets going, I just think it could have been done better. And while yes, this is a bit nitpicky, I just don't feel like praising the hell out of this game at every turn. That's what everybody else has been doing for over 20 years. I prefer to take a more critical, analytical look at things. And that shouldn't actually upset any fans of the game watching this. Most of the time, analyzing Final Fantasy VI in depth only reveals its positive elements. For the most part, the game just keeps getting better and better from this moment on. And that better, I just mentioned, starts with the introduction of Locke. I know I'm skipping over Kefka's early cameo, but we'll get to Kefka very soon. Locke Cole, the handsome, brave, the treasure hunter, is one of the very best Final Fantasy characters of all time. I'd easily put him in my top 5 Final Fantasy characters list, maybe even in my top 3. Locke is one of those protagonists that proves Squaresoft was at the peak of its storytelling powers during the 90s. Locke's introduction is played mostly for laughs. The game starts establishing the enormous depth of the character from very early on. It's not a coincidence, or a decision made by writers rolling a dice, that Locke is the one helping Terra here. It all ties into Locke's past and the guilt he has always felt since you-know-what happened to you-know-who. It's spelled out later during the game, when Celeste tells Locke, "Somewhere deep down you were rescuing her, not me." And I'm sure it applies here too. Locke can't resist the need to help a damsel in distress, because he yearns for redemption for the one time he failed to protect a woman he loved. This is what deep and relatable characters are like. Locke isn't just a fun, cool, and overall good guy. He has a prequel element to his personality. Everything that happened to him in the past explains the way he behaves during the main storyline. There's nothing coincidental, contrived, or lazy about how Locke is written. The writers must have put an enormous amount of time and effort into making him genuinely lovable and emotionally involving as a character, and all that effort paid off. Locke Cole is the best character in the game, and one of the best protagonists I've ever seen in a JRPG. Before I continue analyzing the story and characters, I'd like to briefly mention one area of the game that doesn't get enough credit in my eyes: the graphics. Now, I am playing the Steam version, and I'm also using the World Reborn mod, so I feel the need to show some screenshots from the original SNES version to actually demonstrate what I mean. Just one look at some of these battle screen backgrounds, and the effort put into the game's visual design becomes apparent. The distant mountains, clouds, and trees almost look like they're taken from actual photographs, when the screenshots are reduced in size, and also when you squint your eyes a bit anyway. And remember, I am saying this as someone who wasn't even aware of the Final Fantasy games before the PlayStation 2 era. This is excellent pixel art, and I can totally agree with those who say that in many ways these 2D graphics have aged much better than the early 3D of Final Fantasy 7 has. That's not to say that 7 doesn't have exciting and atmospheric locations. There's certainly more variety in many of the areas in 7. But I actually think the 2D of Final Fantasy 6 might be more immersive for a lot of gamers these days. Speaking of immersion, kind of, some of the very first random enemies you fight are just amazing. Not in terms of gameplay, mind you. The early world map random encounters are almost ridiculously easy, which is the case with many other FF games too, but I mean, just look, it's a cabbage rabbit. A flipping rabbit cabbage rabbit. Apparently the official name is Leaf Bunny, but I don't care, for me it's a cabbage rabbit. I swear, if I keep running into too many of them, I'm going to make a song about them. I won't be able to resist writing a tune about rabbit cabbage rabbits. All joking aside, I do really love this monster design, as it's just perfect for Final Fantasy VI, a game that combines humor and darker elements so effortlessly in its story and themes most of the time. Cabbage rabbit. It's in Figaro that Final Fantasy VI really gets its storytelling engine running. This is where pretty much all of the game's strengths are revealed to us all at once. For starters, the design of Figaro Castle is glorious, by far one of the most magnificent fortress designs in video game history. But we can barely find the time to admire it before we are introduced to the king. Edgar is another fantastic character in FF6. His introduction and backstory combine superbly to establish a thoroughly entertaining and yet emotionally complex hero. A hero that is both intelligent and foolish, arrogant and vulnerable. It is also in Figaro that the most crucial plot point so far arises, the realization that Terra will have to make a hugely important choice very soon. The entire Figaro Castle sequence is excellent. For those wondering why I didn't mention Kefka's arrival, we'll get to Kefka, we will, I promise. I just wanted to take some time to talk about Terra first. In my opinion, Terra is undoubtedly the game's main character, even if the World of Ruin opens with a player in control of Celes instead. And while Locke is the best character in the game, I've never understood those who consider him the main character. I mean, the central plot, revolving around espers and magic, even has more to do with Strago than Locke. So, Locke is the best character, but Terra is pretty close. Some may argue that the main character with amnesia was a cliché even way back in 1994, and it'd be hard to disagree with that. But in my opinion, Final Fantasy VI handles that element of Terra's journey and growth pretty well. During the early stages of the game, the story focuses less on the mystery of who Terra is and where her magical abilities come from, and much more on what Terra has to do, which is make a choice about who she will ally herself with. What makes this so interesting and engaging is that Terra has very little information about not just who she is, but also about what's happening in the world in general. The Final Fantasy games that I've played over the years have almost always done a superb job at making me care about the respective main characters. Whether it was being intrigued by Cloud having auditory hallucinations in the reactor, or watching Cecil struggle with trying to balance his duties with his conscience, or Zidane simply being too likable to ignore, I always cared. Terra's no exception, which is all the more impressive as far as character writing goes, because unlike the other main protagonists I mentioned, she is almost anonymous to the player. In spite of that, it is still effortless to care for Terra, because her situation, where she must make a hugely important decision with little to no information to guide her, is something that a lot of us, if not all of us, can probably relate to. Also, contrary to what her being almost anonymous might imply, Terra has personality and even charisma from the very beginning, even if it is subtle. She wishes to do the right thing, and fears the possibility that someone, including herself, might abuse her natural powers. So, she's clearly a kind person. There's also her thanking Edgar and Locke and winking at them, which I really liked because it implies that Terra was paying attention to how vulnerable Edgar appeared to be to her good looks. These subtle character moments and traits are powerful enough to make Terra an intriguing, likable, and relatable protagonist from pretty much the moment the story really gets going. This is a character whose journey and ultimate fate we as players will really want to follow and find out. There is one element to how Terra's story begins, however, that doesn't work very well. As I said, the memory loss part is just fine. It's nothing spectacular or original, but the consequences of it are well thought out. It's the cause of Terra's amnesia that is the problem, in my opinion. The slave crown. It's a pretty lame plot device. A piece of equipment that is apparently very effective and isn't all that rare, as Arvis in Narsh claims that Terra has recovered surprisingly fast, implying there are enough slave crowns and their victims out there for someone living far away from the Empire's capital to be aware of both. Now, this raises a painfully obvious and rather important question. Why do we never see slave crowns being used again? I can think of several instances where they might have been useful. I can also think of many characters that would have stayed loyal or would perhaps have been more efficient servants to Gestal if they had been equipped with a slave crown. Celeste and Seed are two rather obvious examples of this. I know some might write this off as me needlessly nitpicking, but I don't think I am nitpicky in this case. If I wanted to nitpick the game, I could instead ask why we don't see Figaro Castle's air conditioning devices covered before the castle sinks into sand. Or I could complain about how a castle digging its way through the earth makes no sense at all. I could also ask why these two Magitech knights just stand and wait while our characters talk about Terra's abilities as if they weren't just in the middle of a fight to the death. But alas, I'm not making a big deal or any deal at all about those things. They are all just fine. This is a fantasy setting, and a moving castle is perfectly acceptable within it. Making a big deal about the slave crown never reappearing is not nitpicky. While a mind control device is just as easily acceptable in a fictional setting as an earth-piercing castle, what is not so simple to accept is that it or its copies were never ever used or even mentioned again. That would be like Figaro Castle never moving again while its mechanisms were working correctly even once the necessity to move arrived. Such a lack of consistency does create a certain amount of narrative tension, and concerning the slave crown, that tension is never resolved.
Hey, sorry to stop the review for a second, but I just got this package and the delivery guy said it was urgent, so I have no idea what's in here. It's some kind of a device, and here's a letter. A gift to the reviewer from the north. The slave crown doesn't control your mind, it makes you king of the slaves. Wear it with pride. Signed, Mr. Pevka Kalasso. That name sounds familiar. I think he went to school with my grandmother. Wow! It's an actual slave crown! And apparently it makes you king of the slaves. I gotta try this thing. Yeah, this feels pretty awesome. King of the slaves, imagine that. Final Fantasy VI is the most perfect game ever made. The reviewer from the north would like to withdraw every criticism he has had of the game.
Seeing as I am now under the influence of the slave crown, let's talk about the guy who most likely invented it. The one, the only, the Kefka. I'm going to save most of my thoughts on Gestal's court mage / jester for a future episode, but I wish to quickly address Kefka's presentation in this scene which properly introduces him, as the previous time we saw him was merely a minor glimpse of the man. I once heard a criticism of Kefka that truly boggled my mind, from a former critic at Channel Awesome called Bennett the Sage. If memory serves, he criticized Kefka's appearance and personality by saying that you can't take Kefka seriously because he looks like a reject from Cirque du Soleil. Rarely have I seen or heard a video game critic miss the point of a character and his visual design more severely. Kefka's arrival and attack on Figaro Castle demonstrate both his thoroughly evil and twisted nature and his clownish, somewhat incompetent manner of dealing with obstructions. But the emphasis is clearly on making Kefka look like a bit of a joke. That's deliberate, and it's not a weakness of his character, it is a strength. Kefka later becomes the undisputed ruler of a world that he tore apart, and the reason why such an arc works in the first place is that Kefka doesn't seem like too dangerous of a threat at first. Just imagine if there was no Kefka in the game, and the already powerful and appropriately dressed Emperor Gestal, the traditional villain type, became the ruler of the entire world instead. How much less interesting would that be? Also, the key to understanding Kefka as a character lies in noticing the obvious. He never changes his appearance after defeating Gestal. Think about that. Kefka no longer has any need to dress like a jester, yet he continues to do so regardless. In my opinion, it is rather clear that Kefka's appearance reflects the way he sees all the world, particularly all humans. Mankind's existence, people and their relationships, and the search for meaning in life is a bad joke to him, and he doesn't mind looking like an exaggerated parody of it all. In that sense, Kefka is one of the most punk rock villains of all time, and I mean that as a compliment, as classic anti-establishment punk rock was flipping awesome. For the purpose of my future analysis of Kefka and his arc, it is also important to remember this moment, where Kefka says, "Emperor Gestal's stupid orders, these recon jobs are the pits." It will become apparent why I wished to draw attention to these lines in a later episode of this series. If you allow me to play the role of Captain Obvious, I'll also mention that Kefka's laughter is one of the most brilliant sound effects ever, especially considering that it was already present in the original SNES version of the game. Once Terra, Locke and Edgar make their escape and leave Kefka stranded in the desert in an amusing and adventurous cutscene, the story moves on to South Figaro. Nothing much happens in this town during our first visit, but this is nonetheless one of my favorite moments in Final Fantasy VI, and there are about a half a dozen reasons why. It's one such part of FF6 that is so great, I barely know where to start explaining why I love it. First of all, we are given mildly useful hints to upcoming events. Secondly, we are introduced to one of the most badass characters in the franchise, Shadow. Thirdly, we are given a chance to explore a town that is untouched by the Empire at this point, and thus the stakes of the story become somewhat more precise. The scene where we saw Gestal's cold, lifeless, metallic-looking empire is still fresh in our minds at this point, and the contrast between that scenery and the beautiful, colorful and serene South Figaro is genuinely effective in guiding our emotions. Whether consciously or subconsciously, we feel that this is a place worth preserving as it is. We'd never want the Empire to get their dirty hands on it. Out of all three locations our heroes have been in so far, South Figaro is not just the most lovely one, but clearly also the most vulnerable one. It was yet another superb decision on the part of Squaresoft's team to allow us to see the town in its free and natural state before our party moves on to the mountains. The fourth reason why I adored this part of the game ties into the others, and that is the music. Call me Captain Obvious once more for all I care, but Nobuo Uematsu's soundtrack for this game is just phenomenal, and Final Fantasy VI might just have the best score in the series. The song that plays in South Figaro is an excellent example of Uematsu's genius. For what it's worth, I have participated in an online video game music course, and am a published metal musician, even though I've never officially composed songs for video games. The reason I bring this up is not to brag, but to offer some insight into how much effort goes into music composition. As part of the course I took, I had to compose a theme song for an RPG village, and it was only once I tried my hand at such an assignment that I realized something I had never dreamed of before. Believe it or not, but you can come up with a pretty good tune, write it, arrange it, record it, mix and master it, and then discover that while it is a great piece of music, it just does not work with the village or town that it was meant for. Even if your composition is peaceful, well structured and has a nice flow, it might not fit. The South Figaro theme fits the location perfectly. It's not just a lovely song, it feels as much part of the town as do the buildings or the locals, if not more so. This type of achievement in composing a soundtrack is not just a matter of inspiration, a strong musical education, or the willingness to work hard on one's ideas. A theme song this ideal, and indeed a soundtrack this phenomenal, is born only when all three requirements are met at the highest level humanly possible. The time has come for this first part of FF6's full game review to draw to a close. So let us do a recap, shall we? A somewhat contrived beginning and one rather lazy plot device aside, Final Fantasy VI is a good, even a pretty awesome experience right from the start. We're only about an hour into the story, and the game has already established 5 characters with unique and intriguing personalities and memorable theme songs. We've seen some wonderfully designed locations and been witness to several adventurous, yet significant events that not only introduce the world and the themes of the game, but also do a pretty great job at establishing the stakes of the entire story. And, to be fair, we've also fought in a ton of totally tensionless random battles that have been especially easy since Edgar and his insanely overpowered tool ability became available. All things considered, Final Fantasy VI is a game that gets off to a rather strong start, and as those who've played the entire thing know, it mostly only gets better from here on. Please join me in the next episode as I take a further look at this legendary game, its many successes, and some of its less successful elements too. I hope you've enjoyed my analysis and my opinions in this episode. May you always find great art to enjoy, and may you never run out of coffee and cookies. Wait a minute, another random battle? What the? It's another cabbage rabbit! Cabbage rabbit, running through the fields of green without a care. Cabbage rabbit, a rabbit on a cabbage, that's half of a decent soup right there.